owning the data and all the related network effects and value through essentially blockchain. And that's what it means to have digital property rights.
In Japan, some feel the hype has cooled down a bit, Web3.
But at the end of the day, the question isn't to be asked about what is there hype. The question is it useful technology? Can it actually be something that gives people more power? Is it something that people find valuable? I mean, the vision for Animoca Brands is basically we're building future economies through digital property rights.
What is your ultimate strategy and expectation for the Japanese market?
On the anime IP side, we think that that's a way in which this anime IP can broaden access to the world by creating more ownership and bringing more capital for this type of development into Japan.
皆さんこんにちは、MC の田中です。注目のゲストをお呼びしてキャリア、事業内容、ビジョンを深掘りする&トーク。今回はプラットフォーム依存から脱却する個人主導の未来をテーマにAnimoca Brands Japanの提供でお送りします。本日のゲストをご紹介します。ヤットシウさんです。We are honored to welcome our guest, Mr. Yat Su, co-founder and executive chairman of Animoca Brands. Yat, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So for anyone in the Web3 space, Animoca Brands needs no introduction. However, to help our broader audience understand the core of this movement, could you first give us an overview of your company and your vision?
I mean, the vision for Animoca Brands is basically we're building future economies through digital property rights. The idea that everything that is digital is actually a form of property that should be owned by its creators, basically the end users. In order to fulfill this vision, Animoca Brands has done many investments in this space. We're trying to make it a reality. The underlying technology is blockchain. That's why a lot of people look at Animoca as a blockchain company. We have today over 620 portfolio companies, which makes us one of the largest, if not the largest investor in Web3. And also AI and blockchain are very interrelated, which we can talk about later. But that's the vision of Animoca Brands.
That vision is incredibly ambitious. I'd love to dig deeper into the source of that passion. Now focusing on Japan, which I understand is a key market for you. When and for what purpose was Animoca Brands Japan established?
Yeah, I mean, the vision for Animoca Brands really started in 21, right, with an actual execution in 22. You know, we had many partners come in, including MUFG, right? I think the vision between sort of why it made sense is because digital property rights and the whole idea of property rights is also a form of intellectual property rights. And we wanted to find a way in which we could basically present Japanese IP to the world in one where you could have ownership across the board. And, you know, what is Japanese, sort of one of Japan's biggest exports is, you know, manga, anime, and of course, other forms of IP that the world can enjoy. And constructs like NFTs, blockchain technology, basically tokenization, are all ways in which you can essentially expand ownership to the world through essentially this technology medium to the world. And so that was the vision, right? Basically taking Japanese products and offering them to the world. But there was also another one, which is that Japan actually has an opportunity to become also a leader in blockchain.
Leader?
Potentially, because you have a very digital society. Right? The more digital society is, the more game-friendly society is, the more obvious blockchain technology can be used for it. For instance, some of the biggest game companies in the world are here in Japan, right? You know, whether it's Nintendo or Sony or Square Enix, right? These are all here. And all of these companies are very interested in blockchain technology because they realize that for the gamers, when they play with the gaming assets, they actually think of them as property. Even though they don't really own it, they think that those gaming items should be theirs. I mean, ask your children, you know, what they want. They probably want a gaming item and they think it's valuable. So there has to be a form in which they can own the property. And blockchain is really the only way in which you can really have that as a kind of property, right? That's kind of one aspect. And the other thing, of course, is that because of all the IP that Japan has, it actually is a natural way in which, how do we expand that IP ownership around the world? And basically that could be done through tokenization, which is possible through blockchain.
So Animoca Brands Japan is the gateway connecting Japanese IP to the global Web3 system.
That's one. And then, of course, the other one is to introduce blockchain technology from the world into Japan through Animoca KK.
So today, to better understand the relationship between digital platforms and individuals, we have prepared 3 key questions and keywords. The first is the declaration of independence from platforms. And second, the digital ID connecting the world. And the third is reclaiming sovereignty over information. So our first keyword is the declaration of independence from platforms. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is Web3 to you?
A lot of people talk about Web3 as the web of ownership. So when you think about the different stages of the web, right? The first web was the web of read. So when you had the early forms of website, you could read information, you could get information, it was very accessible. And then Web 2 came, which is the social web, which today is where we are right now. All the big platforms in the world are essentially Web 2 companies where you can read and write to the web. But where do you write to? You write to a database. Who owns the database? The platform owns the database. And what's interesting about the database is the data that it generates has now become the most valuable resource on Earth. We would argue that the data and the network effects it creates is even more valuable than oil, right? And other kind of raw materials. Look at the biggest companies in the world. The biggest company in the world, with all the AI and everything, are all data companies. We would not have AI or self-driving cars or the big tech companies if it wasn't for data. But who gives them the data? We do. Every end user, that uses different social platforms and social media basically feeds the data. So in effect, we're all working for free for the platform. We're essentially providing our data and our time, spending their time taking their photos basically on social media. How much time do they spend? It's not 1 minute or 2 minutes. They take the look, they look at the photo, they take the angle, they look at the brush, right? They try to spend many hours to make the content really, really beautiful because they get some likes and they get some attention. But of course, what happens is that attention gets monetized in the form of advertising, right? And so you don't own any of this. Now, when you think of likes and follows, that is a kind of currency. Why do people want 1 million followers? Why do they want 1 million likes? Because it has value. It may have social value and social status, which translates also into economic value. It's kind of like fame. If you are famous, then you have a form of value, which you can monetize in different ways, right? So that is a currency. But who owns this currency? The currency is owned by the platform. So in Web3, we have a possibility now of owning the data and all the related network effects and value through essentially blockchain. And that's what it means to have digital property rights. And when we talk about a kind of digital independence, an ability to really own that, we have to do it in a data structure that doesn't belong to anyone, which is why it's built on blockchain. Because if you think about blockchain technology, it's decentralized. It's not owned by one company that can control everything. The users are the one who have ownership of this. And that was really the original promise of the internet. The first phase of the internet was supposed to be decentralized. It was supposed to be for everyone. And then with Web 2, the large data companies and the tech platforms kind of took control of this. And think today, when you make a mobile app, or when you make an application, or even when you make a game, actually, you need those platforms. You are dependent on them, and they can actually control your destiny. So in Web3, you can own your own destiny.
Was there any specific key incident that led you to this belief of Web3?
Well, I mean, there are many, but the most famous one was in 2012, where we were one of the biggest developers on basically a mobile app platform, and they removed all of our apps basically. And the reason they removed apps, we will never know why. However, the reason they probably did it is because they thought we did something they didn't like, but we didn't have a judiciary. I mean, for instance, in the real world, if someone disagrees with you commercially, there is a court, there is a judge, you have a jury, you can have an adjudication. There's a process where we can sort of defend for our rights and say, this is right, this is wrong. But when you exist in a platform, you exist on their particular services and they decide. And so really, if you think about it, we are now come from a world where the internet was supposed to make us more independent and more free. Instead, we have now become serfs in their kingdoms. Every time we're using a platform, we're actually sort of depending on them and they decide the rules. And so they removed all of our apps. And we realized that we actually didn't have any independence whatsoever, right? We depended on their platforms. So that to me is where, again, Web3 and blockchain is relevant because we can build products and we can also distribute and own customers on chain basically directly. Think of not just, every platform that's out there, not just with apps. Just think about music platform. The artists and creators who make music do not know who their customers are on those platforms. The platform knows who they are, but they don't. right? And so they have no relationship with the customer, and that's intentional. Because if they own the customer, then you're just content. If you have an ability to own the customer and have a direct relationship, then you build your own network, then you can be potentially independent and you have more freedom as a result, right? So it's really all about basically how power is structured here. And in this case, the platforms want to centralize that power because they want to keep the customers away. In social media, you have maybe, again, if you have 1 million followers, do you know every single one of your followers? Can you reach them? Can you connect with them? Of course you can't. You need the platform's permission to do so because they're not really yours.
But in Japan, some feel the hype has cooled down a bit on Web3. But how do you perceive the current state of this evolution?
Every type of industry change, there's always going to be ups and downs, right? It's going to be somewhat volatile. However, when you think about it, back in 2001 or 2002, people used to say the internet was dead, right? And they said that, internet hype, we don't care and that kind of stuff. I think the same is true for Web3. But at the end of the day, the question isn't to be asked about what is there hype. The question is it useful technology? Can it actually be something that gives people more power? Is it something that people find valuable? And the answer is clearly yes. Perhaps one of the most famous examples in Web3 is stablecoins, right? And there's somewhere like 300 million people in the world who now depend on stablecoins. That was basically a very small figure before. But also, it opens up their economic opportunities where they would not normally have had access to a way to do commerce with that, right? So that's just one example. Or, for instance, other places who don't have a bank account. All those countries in the Philippines and so on who don't have a bank account, now they just need to have a digital wallet and need to have access to essentially, Web3 technology, tokenized sort of RWAs and assets, and now immediately they have access to more various opportunities that they wouldn't have before.
Web 2, for most people, I think, don't feel unfree in their daily lives. So why is this independence so necessary right now for you? Is there a hidden cost to this convenience that we are overlooking?
There is always a classic argument, which is between when you think about the area of freedom and full freedom versus essentially security. And there's always a pendulum shift, right? If you have something incredibly secure, you typically also have less freedoms. But if you have something too free, right, you might have less security, right? So there's always this balancing act between, right? And by the way, just on this topic, blockchain actually provides a very good infrastructure that can have both the freedom, right, which is privacy preserving, but then also have the kind of security because of the fact that it's transparent, so you can see everything. But why it's important is that because you need to have sovereignty of your assets. I think most people, if you ask them, should you own your money? The answer is yes. Should you own your house? The answer is also yes. Right?
Yes.
But right now, how is your house protected? Your house is protected by the government you live in, or the country you live in, that has a rule and a system that if someone tries to take your house, there is a form of adjudication that's not possible. And then you can have the trust and invest in an ecosystem because if I invest in this house, it is my house. Nobody can take it away. And it's the basis of prosperity for any nation. But in the digital world, the kind of house we build is virtual. For instance, if you have 1 million followers on your social media, that is a house too.
Asset.
Yes, it's an asset, right? But they can take it away anytime. And it happens all the time. I don't like your content. Normally, you're right, that people don't care because it doesn't happen to them until it does, right? And now more and more people have had this situation. This also goes to other topics like censorship, right? For instance, and if you say something that people don't like to hear, there is a point where that censorship, someone decides, basically to infringe on your freedom of speech and say, I don't want to hear this. And then they remove it. And there's a fine balancing act. I agree with the fact that it's not black and white. But at what point do you have the freedom to essentially take your assets and say, okay, fine, I don't like this. However, I can take my customers, I can take my assets somewhere else, right? And that's not possible in the Web 2 construct.
Well, that leads us perfectly to our second keyword, the digital ID connecting the world. So to realize this Web3 world, what specific solutions is Animoca Brands providing?
I mean, there's many, but when we talk about digital identity, I think the very first form of property you need to own is your own, basically. And I think of this a little bit from the historical context. It wasn't that long ago where most humans in the world didn't have a last name. And the reason we didn't have a last name is because we were someone's slave. If you look at the history of our last names, many of them are based on the sort of city you were in or the job that you used to do, because we had to inherit some kind of name from somewhere because we did not have a royal family or a background and that kind of stuff, right? We only had first names. So our very first property is our own name, right? And from that, we can then build essentially our sort of, let's call it our personal kingdom, if you will, and our personal rights within that. In the digital world, as well as in the physical world, it starts with your verification of your identity. What is the most valuable part of your identity? We would argue it's your reputation, right? If you basically have an identity, you build it up, you build your reputation around it, whether you were good at your work, whether you were skilled in your labor, whether you were sort of, honest, a good friend, right? These are all areas of reputation. And that reputation is your currency. It is your value. So how do I prove that? So in the digital world, most of them do it with very simple ratings. Let's say if you're driving or if you're basically using a service, you have 5 stars or 4 out of 5 stars. That's a way to people say, I like this, right? Because 1 million people or 500,000 people said, I like your restaurant or I like your location. However, this is only, again, by single platforms. I cannot move my reputation elsewhere. I can't go to one e-commerce platform and then take that reputation and move it to another platform. It's not possible because it's not my reputation to begin with. A digital identity solution that is decentralized, where you own it, actually allows you to transfer that value of that reputation from one place to another. And the digital identity is then a way in which we can create relationships and bonds with trust in a decentralized manner. Right now, you have to go to a platform to connect you. But why do you have to do that? Right? Because I don't have a way of finding you. I don't have a way of knowing who you are. But if you yourself have essentially a digital identity that can verify who you are and your reputation and your sort of, let's call it network value in these other ecosystems, then other people can connect with you in the same way, right? And I can, I don't have to know your name, but I can trust you because of your reputation and your digital identity. And then from there, we can grow our own social networks. So we see a future where it's not going to one platform. It's much more decentralized, where there's going to be millions of small communities that can potentially become big, but they can all find each other.
So that's what you do in Mocaverse.
That's what we're doing with Mocaverse, correct?
So it's like a digital passport or
it's kind of like a digital passport.
Universal key for the internet.
It is. However, it's decentralized. So the ownership of that passport is not ours. So we do not have any of your data. The data belongs to the end user. If we want access to the data or any of our third-party providers who want access to the data, they have to basically offer you some kind of value. And often that value is in a tokenized format.
Could you elaborate more on, I think, isn't like Mocaverse also a platform?
Yes, well...
In a broad sense. I mean, how does it differ from the closed ecosystems of the past?
Yeah, because it's on blockchain and it's run essentially on a blockchain infrastructure. We ultimately don't own the network itself, right? So when you think about an example like some of the bigger blockchains, whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum, who owns Ethereum? Nobody owns Ethereum, right? And the value and the power of the network is essentially community driven. That's basically the same for Mocaverse.
So in the growing Web3 space, how do you perceive your competitors? Are there any other projects that keep you on your toes?
We are in a kind of unique situation for Animoca Brands because we don't have any current existing competitors that do exactly what we do. And I think that's also because, one, have kind of an Asian conglomerate style model. So we're kind of a digital conglomerate, which is kind of untypical for the West. So we don't really have any Western competitors that way. And also, I think a lot of companies sometimes confuse us because they think we're a VC because we have so many investors.
Investing in so many
right?
companies.
And in that sense, you could say, but yeah, there's many VCs. There's Sequoia, there's A16Z, there's all these companies that are also obviously big investors in Web3. However, we're not a fund. We invest out of our balance sheet, right? And that, again, is quite different. So for now, I would argue that Animoca Brands is a fairly unique company.
So regarding reputation that you talked about, specifically, what kinds of actions or achievements are considered as a positive value in Mocaverse?
Or for instance, are you using the game? Are you using the application? And of course, are you financially savvy? Are you using different products and services? Are you responsible? These obviously just create a kind of score over time. And what's important is that what really will happen over the longer term is that it unlocks the ability to eventually have unsecured credit. I mean, just think about, the real world. We have a lot based on unsecured credit. Even your job is unsecured credit, right? What happens is that someone gives you a job and agrees to pay you a monthly salary on the promise of your ability to do the work, right? But for the first 30 days, you don't know whether they can do the work well. You assume that. How do I know that? Because of your resume, because of your background, right? Again, it's based on your reputation. And in Web3, that's essentially what Mocaverse wants to do. It wants to create a way in which you can measure your reputation. And essentially, this will not just open up unsecured credit. It can open up job opportunities, prospects, right? Some of the biggest platforms in the world today are ways in which you try to hire people, right? People use social media to try to find jobs. But do you know if he's a real person? Can you certify whether he actually went to this college? Are you sure that he actually went to work for those companies? And essentially, blockchain can verify that. And if you have an ID system that really sort of verifies that across, then you can have the certainty that this person is qualified for, whatever opportunity he or she is looking for.
But on the flip side, if someone makes a mistake once, will that record follow them forever, like making it harder for them to participate in the community again?
The way we do it's about privacy preserving technology, which means that you have the choice to offer this let's call it concern or not, right? Now, it could be that someone says, I need all the data, right? For instance, when you go for an application to mortgage a house or something, right? You probably need to give all your information, the good and the bad, because you will simply not get, a loan unless you show everything. However, that information will only be known between the bank and you. And so you're okay to do that because it's a small group of people, right? And with blockchain, with what we call zero knowledge proof, you can essentially verify these elements without necessarily having to reveal it to a wider audience or to reveal everything about it, right? But there are some applications where you don't need that. So for instance, I think it's crazy that, I don't live in Japan. So when I go shopping, I go tax-free, right? Okay. I give my passport.
Right.
They take my entire information and
Every
they take
time?
a photo of the passport, which I think is crazy. You don't need to know my whole name, my background, where I live.
When you just shop for tax-free.
For tax-free, right? You just need to know, am I a tourist? Have I come to Japan? You don't even actually need to know my name, right? And so with blockchain technology, you can limit that. And it's okay. For the tax-free guys, actually, that's all they need. They don't need to know everything about you per se, right? So it's a flip side as well, right? Which is that I would argue we're giving too much information all the time because we lack the systems and infrastructure to do so.
So to understand the scale of this new ecosystem, Mocaverse, when was it actually begin?
So we started Mocaverse in the Moca ID really just last year, right? So it's pretty new. And we've got some big partnerships, basically with, Korean telcos, Asian companies and so forth. Millions of users are currently using it. However, it's something that we're obviously looking to expand further. People can sign up for it directly. We're launching essentially our own chain for it as well. But yes, it's a fairly new project.
And is there any cost for users to join this public infrastructure?
So the cost to join is zero, right? But then ultimately, if you start using it and people start paying you for it, then obviously you have to pay something because there's an exchange of value.
So beyond individual benefits, what are the strategic advantages for companies joining the Mocaverse ecosystem?
Well, if you join the Mocaverse ecosystem, one, you have access to millions of users that are already verified, right? Which means that if you want to do business or commerce or you want their data, you can essentially transact and sort of, do business with them. The second thing, and I would argue this is a big deal, especially for smaller companies, is if you want to deal with sort of compliance issues, say like in Europe, there's GDPR, right? It's very hard for you as a small or medium-sized company to deal with all of the security compliance around data privacy, which means that you probably won't even go there, right? You won't even offer the service. But if the data is not yours, it's held by the user, you can now basically offer a service that does that, right? So for smaller companies, they don't need all the compliance work because the blockchain, basically Moca ID, takes care of all of that for you, right? And the key is custody of the data. In the same way that if you have your own money with custody of money, then it's your responsibility. But if I give the money to a person or a bank or an institution, then the institution is responsible. And then they need licenses and they need structures around it because they're keeping money on your behalf. It's the custody, right? And so in the same way that blockchain allows you to hold your own assets, like you can hold your own digital assets in your own wallet, you essentially can hold all your own data and essentially have all the responsibilities and actions of your own data and private information yourself, right? Which basically means that you're responsible, but you also get the benefits for it. And that's basically where companies can benefit. Even very large corporations are signing up basically to be using Moca ID because they don't want to deal with all the compliance issues around the privacy of their data and their content.
What kind of services are existing in Mocaverse?
Well, I mean, the ones that are public right now, I mean, you can exchange data. You also have a reward system as well. It's kind of like a point system as well, because the more actions you get, the more points you receive. And then there's third-party companies that say, hey, I like you as a customer. You have this reputation, so I will give you something. I mean, today, for instance, when you think about customer acquisition, when you do advertising, you have a few ways to advertise. One, you spend money advertising on a big platform, or what you can also do is you give them a benefit, right? Like when you sign for a credit card, they say, hey, you sign for a credit card, you get a toaster, or you get some kind of, sort of a toy or something. Basically, companies do the same thing, but they base it based on your digital reputation. So the end user has a benefit as well.
So what is the business model for your partners? I mean, as more companies look to join Mocaverse as a public infrastructure, I think many are curious about the cost.
Yes.
Do they require to pay a participation fee or
no? So
subscription cost?
Yeah, I mean the cost to participate is they need to own Moca tokens, right? Because without Moca tokens, they can participate in the network. However, outside of that, then if they want to use the data, then they have to pay for the data. If they don't want the data, then of course there's no point in using it. Or if they want the customer, then they have to pay for the customer as well. But the difference in a network like Moca Network is that by paying, the customer receives the benefit, as opposed to just the company receives the benefit. And this goes to the argument around advertising. For instance, if I want to reach the customer and I'm willing to spend billions of dollars in advertising, we think that some of that value should go to the end user. The platform benefits because the customer also has a way in which it can share in the opportunity, and that's why a lot of users find it appealing, because they can get actually the benefit of their data.
So as an open shared infrastructure like Mocaverse spreads globally, what kind of world do you envision?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, we do think that if you own your own digital property rights, you own your identity, and you get the value shared across the space, we think the world will become much more equitable and fairer. Think about how much data we generate and how much value is given to the platforms for that data. We know it's billions. The largest company in the world today are worth trillions of dollars. Calculate that number.
Can't imagine.
Even 10 years ago, there were no trillion-dollar companies. And now we have at least 7 or 8, maybe more, right? And there will be more. When you think about all those AI companies, their private valuation is $100 or $200 billion already, right? So these are all going to be trillion-dollar companies. But how did they become trillion-dollar companies? From our data. How does AI learn to speak like a human? From us. Who did they take the data from? From our books, from our literature, from our movies, from our music, from all of our human creation. So our point is that value should be shared to the end user. And that's not going to be possible because they don't want to. But if you put everything on blockchain, if you tokenize it, then essentially you can now advocate for your rights. And that's actually how you can also get paid. Because also a blockchain tokenized infrastructure will allow everyone to get paid for it in real time. And again, for users, it's hard to imagine because they say, what is my data worth? Because it's only worth 10 cents or 5 cents or whatever. But it's not about the one transaction. It's about millions of transactions that are using your data, each of them worth just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cents. And then they add up, right? And so now if you're a content creator, you will be paid fairly for your content. Or if you bring friends to the social network, you should also get rewarded for that, right? That's how we see the world. And in that sense, we'll have a much more fair distribution of wealth.
So now we are moving to our last keyword, reclaiming sovereignty over information. As individual freedom increases, won't security and privacy management become more precarious?
Some people in the industry have described it quite well, which is that in the current world, in Web2, we have forgotten how to keep our data or our digital life secure because they outsourced the security completely. But in the real world, you don't just cross the road and don't look where the car is coming. There's a road and you look here, you look there, and you say, okay, car, danger. Okay, you don't just walk through, right? But in the digital world, we just walk through, right? We don't look at the terms of service. We just click, and we just move on to the next element. So I think part of it is we have to teach people about your digital sovereignty comes with a kind of personal responsibility as well. We're not saying that it has to be complicated, but you do have to know it, right? I mean, it's the same with money, right? I mean, when you have money, you kind of want to be careful about it. Whether you put it in a bank, whether you put it underneath your bed, when you put it in a safe, we all have different ways in which we keep that safe. But I think the key is not whether it's digital or not. I think the key is whether we think it's valuable. So if I think my data is valuable, I will protect it. It doesn't matter if it's physical art or if it's digital art. If you tell our children that you might lose your game items, they will try to protect it, right? They will think it's important, right? Or if you tell them, hey, someone's going to steal your Pokemon cards, they will try to protect it, right? And they will find ways to keep it safe. I think it's exactly the same. So reclaiming digital sovereignty isn't the technology only. The technology already allows you to claim it in a safe and secure way. People complain and say, oh, I have to remember the keyword or the password. There's many ways to do it simpler and easier. You don't have to have it in this way. This is an old way of keeping it safe. It's kind of like an old safe versus a new kind of vault, right? Technology can solve it. The key thing is, why should I do it, right? And if I think it's, if my valuable game items could be lost, if someone can steal my digital assets, if someone can take my valuable art away from me, if someone can take, my income away from me, it doesn't matter what the technology is, I will do whatever it takes to protect. So I think we need to tell people why it's valuable. And then, with things like Mocaverse, they can experience the value. If you know how much money you could get paid in your social media, you will protect it as well.
So education is the key.
Education is the key, but more importantly, part of the education is also learning essentially about money and value. So this is, I guess, maybe the other point around sovereignty, right? Our view on the value of sovereignty is that you need to understand assets, which means you kind of need to understand about money and have a form of financial literacy. And if you don't have financial literacy, then you don't understand why it's worth something, right? And what's great about blockchain and tokenization is that it can introduce the concept of money and financial literacy in points of areas of passions that you're interested in. So how do our children learn about money? They don't learn it in school, but they learn it with things like Pokemon cards. I have an expensive Pokemon card or I have a cheap Pokemon card. And then suddenly I realize, hey, there's value. Someone wants it. Then suddenly I'm learning without going to school about demand and supply. I get some basic ideas about microeconomics, right? Because it's fun and it's interesting. And then you learn about them. I think that's one of the real powers of tokenization and blockchain.
So in that context, how will the importance of Web3 change with the rapid evolution of AI?
The very simple answer is, what do you think AI will transact in? It's going to be tokens. The currency and the asset class of AI is all going to be tokenized. If I'm an AI and I want to basically buy an asset or buy a good from someone else, do I have a bank account? Can I trade? Am I allowed to do it? I don't have permission. Which bank account will let an AI tap into it? But if it's tokenized, if it's on blockchain, I can trade it naturally. And today in AI anyway, we already effectively have to spend tokens, even if they're not on the blockchain. They're essentially a proxy for the commodity that is, in the future, we believe going to be tokenized anyway. So that's kind of, one of the key elements. And so we also believe, therefore, a good hedge for an AI future is to essentially be, let's call it digital assets. Because it's kind of like the real estate of AI. We today have AI agents in the world that are running independent actions where you basically just tell them, hey, can you buy this for me? Can you trade this for me? Can you do these actions? And they can do it 24/7. But they can't do it if it's not a token. It has to be on blockchain. And because blockchain today, market value is $2.5 to $3 trillion. Trading is hundreds of billions of dollars a day. There's enough liquidity that the AI agents can do this. So we perceive a future where AI agents are going to be almost exclusively dealing with token assets. And we also think that every person in the world will have at least one AI agent, probably more. In fact, we think many people will have 10, 20, 30 AI agents. There'll be a psychology agent, there'll be a money agent, there'll be a whatever agent. They'll help you, right? All of them are going to transact with each other in a token infrastructure.
To bring this global movement back to Japan, a nation with an incredible legacy of creativity and IP, like anime games. What is your ultimate strategy and expectation for the Japanese market?
There's so many areas. I mean, we can start first with anime and IP, but I think it's beyond that. On the anime IP side, as I said earlier, we think that that's a way in which this anime IP can broaden access to the world by creating more ownership and bringing more capital for this type of development into Japan. I guess without naming names, much of the movie production and content production is now funded by really just one or two companies. And the thing is that they buy all the IP. The IP is not owned by the creator. We think that's wrong. When some of the biggest productions in the world that have made billions of dollars to the platform and the creator gets millions, or maybe even low millions, that's 0.0 whatever percent of the production. And they say, yes, they took the risk. However, there's no upside for that, right? So the way to deal with this is to create more community ownership. If the funding can be done through fans of the network, then essentially the bargaining power for the distribution doesn't belong to one or two companies. It belongs essentially to the owner of the IP, who can then get the best deal. Why did Michael Jackson become so successful financially? Because he owned his music. In fact, one of the things that he did before, what he did quite innovatively back then in the 80s, is he decided that he wanted to own his own IP, right? And because he owned his own IP, there was a library and legacy that could go. Most musicians don't own their IP. They give it to someone else and they license it out. And as a result, the IP owner has all the rights, but the creator doesn't have much at all, right? And so through tokenized infrastructure, we can create a better ecosystem. And we think that's important. And we think this brings more capital for other people because people around the world love Japanese manga, IP, anime, and so on, that they can basically sort of become a co-investor or can be a partner in this. But the second part, which I think is even more relevant, is for industrial applications. When you think about what a blockchain tokenization infrastructure can do, and with things like AI, with things like robotics, actually, this is an area where, again, we think a tokenized infrastructure becomes quite relevant. And of course, here in Japan, it's very much about automation. And we see a lot of automation that's happening. Right now, it's a lot of human to machine automation. So you are very good with digital payments and so forth. But the next level of automation that we'll have as end user is not human to machine, it's machine to machine. And machine to machine requires essentially a kind of tokenized infrastructure, which again, I think will be very valuable for the Japanese economy.
I hear you look toward a NASDAQ listing. What role does the Japanese market play in Animoca Brands' global strategy?
Consumer market. There's a lot of IP here that we want to partner with. There's a lot of licensing opportunities that we see here. And, Japan is in many ways a digital first nation. And so we think that there would be a potential for having a lot of people who are interested in Web3 and blockchain. Compared to the rest of the world, on the corporate enterprise side, Japan is quite forward, right? You've got some of your biggest companies here that are launching and running their own blockchain and so forth. However, in the consumer side, I would say Japan is somewhat behind because most people in Japan who own digital assets, they only own them for speculative purposes. So they're not owning them to use them. But really to get the value of blockchain, you have to use the assets, right? And I would say that part, Japan is a little bit behind. However, that's also the opportunity because it's kind of like if you see the internet opportunity, it doesn't matter which country it is. If a country has a low adoption of internet, then that's the opportunity, right? And so I think the same is true for us here in Japan.
So as we conclude, could you share some final words with our audience about the hope and possibilities on Web3, what Web3 brings to our daily lives?
When you think of the macro, what is the biggest problem we have in the world? And Japan doesn't feel it quite yet because Japan has had, if you think about it, a very interesting fiscal policy that essentially has limited your inflation to almost zero, zero before, now is rising a little bit, right? And so Japan is only now beginning to experience what the rest of the world has experienced for 20 years, which is inflation. Inflation has been basically a big denominator and factor, particularly when you think about things like QE, that have caused wealth inequality. So how do you solve wealth inequality? If you look at places like US or Europe or Hong Kong or everywhere in the world, more and more wealth is going to the 1%, and the middle class is being squeezed out, and most of the world is actually having less and less sort of, money and income. And our point is that it's not just opportunity, it's lack of financial literacy. They don't know how to invest. They don't know anything about money. We live in a capitalist world, but most of us are not capitalists, as in we don't invest. We still live in a labor economy. We work and we live and we make salary. Then we put the money in the bank. Basically the value of the money depreciates because it doesn't cover for inflation, right? And then over time, basically you end up somehow not being able to afford it. And you can see it with our youth as well. Young people can't afford to buy a home, right? Because they don't have the ability. Whereas certainly my parents' generation, maybe our generation, right? We could take a job and we could work somewhere, and we knew that through the effort of our work, eventually we can buy a home, right? This is probably not true in most places in the world. We think the solution is you have to have financial literacy. You have to know about money. You can't not know about it. But how do you do it? And we think, again, blockchain and tokenization opens up the pathway for learning about money, because essentially your assets that you know about can now have some financial value. 30 years ago, early days of the internet, we had this construct called digital literacy. Most people didn't know about the internet. They had to be digital literate. This type of thing doesn't exist. Now everyone's digital literate. But back then, you had to have digital literacy. I had to print my emails out for my boss because he had to read it. Okay, he didn't use a computer. He didn't know how to do that, right? Of course, today, nonsense. Everyone has to do that. So we went to a world where there was no digital literacy to everyone was digital literate. But if you were not digital literate, your business would lose. You would not get a job. You would essentially be left out. And in this upcoming future, the same is true for financial literacy. So in the same way that the internet spread digital literacy and made knowledge commonplace, we think essentially tokenization will do that for financial literacy. But of course, just as is true for any industry, being early matters. If you were early in social media, if you were early with a smartphone, if you were early with the internet, you had an advantage, which means that the opportunity and the risk is that you have to be early in tokenization and Web3.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.